They rolled their eyes when I spoke, he thought, but the wound went deeper than that. The night began with a shock that froze his chest. Why don't you just keep quiet? Nobody wants to hear your stories anymore. It wasn't whispered. It was his own son, across the table, dismissing him with a smirk, while the others chuckled into their glasses. Christmas lights twinkled on the walls, silverware glinted on polished plates, and yet he felt stripped bare, unwanted, silenced in the very home he had built for them all. He had only tried to share a thought, a small reflection about the struggles he endured when the family had nothing, when bread was rationed and he worked 2 jobs to put food on this very table. But before the words could even take shape, his daughter rolled her eyes, his son-in-law muttered, "Here he goes again," and his grandson let out a stifled laugh. The room was filled not with respect, but with the sharp sting of mockery, a chorus of betrayal dressed up as family conversation. The sound of forks clinking was louder than his voice. He could feel the weight of being an unwanted guest at his own blood's gathering. His daughter leaned closer to her husband, whispering something that ended with another laugh, and the shame burned deeper in his chest. He was no longer a father, no longer a man whose words mattered, at least not here. In this moment, he was reduced to background noise, an old man trying to be heard in a room that had already decided his worth was nothing. The air thickened with dismissal. No one looked at him. No one cared for what he wanted to say. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure, and the cruelest part was the ease with which they did it. Rolling eyes, crooked smirks, the tap of a wine glass. Tiny daggers of humiliation slipped under his skin. Inside, his chest tightened, not with anger, but with a grief that felt heavier than any burden he had carried in his working years. These were his children, his family, and yet their silence, their laughter, their rolling eyes made him feel like a stranger. He sat in his chair, still, as if by not moving he could hold back the flood of pain that pressed against him. But the thought was already there, bitter and unshakable. They no longer see me. They no longer hear me. I am nothing to them. And still, somewhere beneath the humiliation, a spark refused to die. They believed his words had no weight, that his stories were relics of a forgotten time. But he knew something they did not. He knew that beyond this table, beyond their smirks and whispers, the truth about who he was would not only be heard, it would be honored, publicly, undeniably. They would soon learn that the voice they mocked was the same voice the most powerful man in the room would one day call by name. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Could you write in the comments where you're listening from? Have you ever faced something like this in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. He sat among his family, yet felt like an intruder in a house where his very hands had laid the foundation. The table was crowded with laughter, with glasses clinking, with stories that spun around him like a storm, but none of them reached him. It was as if there was an invisible wall, thin but unbreakable, shutting him out of the world he once ruled as father, as guide, as protector. Now he was merely a shadow at the edge of their comfort, present but unwanted. He tried to speak once more, to offer a suggestion about the upcoming family trip, a small idea that could have made things easier. But before his words could find their place in the air, they were brushed aside with the sweep of a hand and a careless smile. "We've got it covered," his son said quickly, not even glancing at him. The others nodded, continuing their planning, as though he had never opened his mouth. His words evaporated before they had weight. There was no argument, no dramatic rejection. It was worse. It was the kind of dismissal that did not even grant him the dignity of being disagreed with. He was not opposed, he was erased. His presence had become a burden, his ideas unnecessary clutter, his voice just background noise against the louder music of their youth and self-importance. In that moment he felt the silence settle around him like chains, every laugh that ignored him, every decision made without him, Every smile that bypassed him became proof that he no longer mattered. The man who had once held their lives together with sweat and sacrifice now sat as if he were a guest overstaying his welcome. His eyes moved slowly around the table, faces he had loved, children he had raised, grandchildren who carried his blood. Not one of them met his gaze. Not one pair of eyes sought his approval or even his recognition. He could have been a stranger, pulled in from the cold and forced into a chair no one wanted filled. The food on his plate grew colder, untouched. His appetite was gone, swallowed by the bitter realization that he no longer belonged in the story of the family he had built. The conversations swirled above him like smoke, loud and careless, while he sat in the shadows of his own legacy. But deep inside, past the hurt, there was still something alive. A quiet ember buried under the ashes of their rejection. He had been ignored, yes, and humiliated, but he knew a truth that none of them could see yet. Beyond this room, beyond their rolling eyes and impatient hands, there was a place where his voice did not vanish. There was a place where his name still carried weight, where it was spoken with respect, with gratitude, with reverence. And when that moment arrived, when they would finally hear how the world saw him, the shame in their eyes would be heavier than any silence they had forced upon him tonight. He gathered his courage once more, hoping that perhaps a story from the past might bridge the distance that had grown between him and his own blood. He spoke softly at first, recalling the years when life had been nothing but labor and sacrifice, when nights were spent mending broken shoes instead of sleeping, when every coin saved meant food on the table for children too small to understand hunger. He thought they might remember, that his words would carry weight because they were not just memories, they were the foundation of their present comfort. But as he spoke, a smirk spread across his grandson's face, a half-hidden laugh that cut sharper than any blade. His daughter leaned back, shaking her head, as if his memories were a tired song she had heard too many times. His son muttered a single word, outdated, with the coldness of dismissal, and the table erupted with polite, stifled laughter. What to him was life's hard-earned lesson became, to them, little more than a punchline. Each word he offered felt heavier than the last, not because of the memories themselves, but because of the wall of ridicule that pushed them back toward him. He wanted them to see the meaning in his struggles, to understand that the comfort they so carelessly enjoyed had been bought by years of pain, years of silence, years of back-breaking labor that robbed him of his youth. Instead, they waved him away like smoke drifting from a dying fire. The betrayal was not in their words alone, but in their eyes. Eyes that no longer saw the man who had carried them through storms, but instead looked at him as if he were a relic, something dusty and irrelevant, something that could be mocked without consequence. It was the eyes of children who believed they had surpassed their father, who had forgotten that his calloused hands once built every wall they leaned on, every door they walked through, every roof that sheltered them from the rain. The bitterness rose in his throat, but he did not shout. He did not slam his fist against the table. He sat still, enduring their laughter as though it were another storm to weather, another burden to carry. But inside, the ache was unbearable. His wisdom, once their lifeline, was now their joke. The man who had been their anchor was now a figure of amusement, a man reduced to background noise in a room filled with voices that had forgotten gratitude. And yet, beneath the humiliation, a promise formed. They could laugh now, dismiss his stories, call his lessons irrelevant, but he knew the day was coming when those same stories would be told by someone else, by a man whose voice carried authority they could not deny. They would hear his name spoken with respect, not whispered with contempt, and in that moment their bitter smirks would turn to silence, their laughter to shame. It was his son's eyes that wounded him most. Others laughed, others smirked, but his son, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders through storms, the boy he had fed when cupboards were nearly bare, looked at him with cold impatience. A slow, deliberate roll of the eyes as if to say, "Here he goes again," as if the man who gave him life had nothing left worth hearing. That single gesture cut deeper than any word, stripping him of dignity more cruelly than open insult ever could. He had endured years of struggle to ensure this son never knew the sharp ache of hunger, never slept beneath a leaking roof, never felt the humiliation of patched shoes at school. He had worked double shifts, skipped meals, swallowed pride in front of strangers, all so his children would never taste the bitterness he had known. And now, across the table heavy with food and laughter, the reward for those sacrifices was a roll of the eyes, a smirk, and silence that pressed like a stone against his chest. In that moment he felt like a stranger in his own house. The air no longer belonged to him. The warmth of family was gone. His voice was not just ignored, it was unwanted. Every glance away, every subtle sigh, every tilt of the head told him the same story. He no longer mattered. His son's eyes, the very eyes that once looked up to him in awe, now looked past him as though he were a burden too heavy to carry, an embarrassment too awkward to acknowledge. The pain ran deeper because it was not just about respect, it was about blood. Strangers can mock, colleagues can dismiss, but when your own flesh and blood denies your worth, the wound lingers like poison. He had poured his life into building a foundation so that his son could walk proudly upon it, yet now that same son acted as if the foundation were a crumbling ruin, best forgotten, best ignored. He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate, fighting the urge to leave, fighting the storm inside that demanded he remind them who he was, what he had done. But he remained still, silent, bearing the humiliation with the same endurance that had carried him through years of hardship. To fight here would give them more laughter. To stay silent was to preserve the last shred of dignity they had tried to strip away. Yet, even in that silence, he knew the truth. His son could roll his eyes, his family could laugh, but outside these walls, the story was different. There was a place where his name was not a burden, but a beacon, where his presence did not bring sighs but gratitude, where the very man his son admired from afar, the CEO whose name commanded rooms, spoke of him not as just an old man, but as the mentor whose guidance had shaped him. That truth burned quietly inside him, waiting, patient, until the moment it would finally rise and silence every smirk, every cold eye, every laugh. The silence was the sharpest betrayal of all. Mockery could be endured. Even eye rolls could be swallowed. But the silence, that was unbearable. Around the table sat those who had once depended on him, those who had leaned on his advice, those who had come to him with trembling hands and uncertain futures, begging for his guidance. He had been the steady hand in their storms, the voice that lifted them when they were lost. Yet now, when laughter rose at his expense, when his dignity was stripped away piece by piece, not one of them opened their mouth to defend him. He looked at each face, one by one. His daughter, whose tuition he had paid by working late into the night until his body begged for rest, stared into her glass as if the wine held more importance than her father's honor. His son-in-law, who had once borrowed money from him to start his business, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing, unwilling to risk breaking the flow of ridicule. Even his grandson, who once ran to him with bright eyes asking for stories, now hid behind a smirk, letting the silence do the work of betrayal. It wasn't their laughter that hollowed him, it was their stillness, their refusal to meet his eyes, their unwillingness to speak a word on his behalf. The table was filled with voices, yet none for him. His humiliation was a spectacle, and they all chose to be the audience, too cowardly or too indifferent to stand beside him. The shame pressed heavier with every heartbeat. He had carried their burdens quietly for years, and in return, they carried nothing for him. Not even a defense, not even a simple acknowledgement of his worth. He had poured his life into building a family that would be strong together, only to discover that togetherness vanished when he was the one left vulnerable. The silence screamed louder than mockery. It told him he was no longer one of them. that his words had no protector, that his very place at the table was conditional, fragile, easily erased. He had built them a future, and they had built him a cage of quiet rejection. And yet, beneath the ache of that silence, something deeper stirred. They believed they had condemned him to invisibility, but they had only revealed themselves. For beyond this house, beyond their coldness, there were others who knew his worth, others who would never sit silent when his name was spoken. There was a stage waiting, a voice of authority ready to honor him openly, to declare what his family had chosen to forget. And when that day came, the silence they had used as a weapon would turn against them, filling their own hearts with shame. He felt the weight of exclusion pressing down on him, heavier than the years he had carried bricks, heavier than the nights he had dragged his body home from work, just to wake before dawn and do it all again. At this table, surrounded by faces born of his sacrifice, he was no longer father, no longer guide, no longer even a man with a voice. He was just the old man who talks too much, a dull hum in the background of their brighter conversations, tolerated but not embraced. His words had become static, his presence an obligation, his very being reduced to something they endured rather than cherished. The realization hollowed him. This was the same family for whom he had broken his back, for whom he had walked miles in shoes split at the seams, for whom he had sat in cold offices, begging for loans to keep food on their plates. Every scar on his hands, every line etched into his face, was carved there by the years he spent building a life they now enjoyed so carelessly. Yet here he sat, invisible, as if all that labor had been a story that belonged to someone else. He watched as they leaned toward one another, laughing, planning, sharing secrets he was no longer invited to hold. When he tried to speak, their eyes slid past him, searching for the next joke, the next story that didn't come from him. He was not just excluded, he was erased in plain sight. The chair he sat in could have been empty, and the night would have gone on the same. That truth crushed his chest more than their laughter, more than their smirks. Memories flickered unbidden, his son at 12, crying when he broke his leg, clinging to his father's hand as though it were the only lifeline in the world. His daughter at 16, terrified of failing her exams, finding confidence only because he whispered, "You can do it. I believe in you." They had forgotten those moments. Or worse, they remembered but no longer cared. Exclusion is not always loud. Sometimes it is a silence so deep it deafens. Sometimes it is laughter that skips over you, as though you were not there. Sometimes it is the slow realization that the table you built no longer has a place for you. That night, he carried the weight of knowing he was no longer a pillar in their eyes. He had become furniture, old, worn, in the room, but unseen. But though their eyes dismissed him, though their voices erased him, he knew there was still another world beyond these walls, a world where his name did not fade into background noise. There were those who had not forgotten, those who still carried his lessons like fire in their veins. There his presence was not endured but honored, and soon his family, who had cast him aside, would be forced to see it, forced to hear it, forced to confront the truth of who he was. The next day the world outside his home felt like another planet. He left the house quietly, coat buttoned against the winter chill, his steps slow but steady. The ache from last night's humiliation still lingered, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, a dignity that refused to die. The city lights shimmered ahead, reflecting against tall glass buildings, cold and brilliant. This was not the dining room where his words dissolved into laughter. This was a different arena, one where silence was not dismissal but respect, one where names carried weight like stones in a foundation. He entered the hall quietly, almost unnoticed. The air here was sharper, filled with the rustle of polished suits, the click of high heels against marble, the low hum of conversations that carried power. Journalists adjusted cameras, businessmen shook hands with measured precision, and leaders moved like planets in their own gravity. He blended into the crowd, a gray figure against a sea of dark suits, but unlike the night before, he did not feel small. He knew something none of them could see yet. The chandelier above scattered light across the hall, making every polished surface glow. He took a seat at the edge of the gathering, content to observe. Unlike his family, no one here looked at him with contempt. No one rolled their eyes or smirked at his presence. He was simply another guest, quiet, unremarkable, yet carrying within him a truth that would soon bend the atmosphere of the room. He noticed his family enter, their laughter as careless as it had been the night before. They had been invited through someone else, basking in borrowed light. When their eyes caught him sitting in the corner, they exchanged glances and small, mocking smiles. To them, he was out of place here, an intruder who had wandered into a room far beyond his worth. He saw their whispers, their smirks, their disbelief that he could belong among sharp suits and powerful voices. But he did not flinch. He did not rise to defend his place. Instead, he folded his hands calmly, watching the crowd, his silence not born of defeat this time, but of patience. They thought he was invisible, but soon the lights would shift, and invisibility would turn into revelation. The stage at the front gleamed with expectation, microphones waiting, cameras poised. The chatter softened, footsteps slowed, and a hush rolled over the room like a tide. The CEO, respected, untouchable, admired by all, stepped forward. A man whose very name commanded attention, whose presence redefined the air. The family straightened in their seats, eager, ready to feast on the reflected glory of being in the same room as him. They had no idea what was about to happen. And there, in the quiet, before the first word was spoken, he sat with steady breath. He was not the old man mocked at dinner. He was not the burden erased by silence. Here, in this gathering beyond family, the truth was waiting to be unveiled, and when it was, it would strike harder than any rebuke he could have spoken at home. When his family entered the hall, they carried themselves with the arrogance of people stepping into a world they believed belonged only to them. Dressed in their best clothes, faces lit with excitement at the thought of brushing shoulders with power, they were eager to be seen, eager to be noticed, eager to stand in borrowed light. They had been invited through a friend, nothing more, but in their minds the invitation was proof that they belonged among leaders and decision-makers. Their laughter trailed behind them as they found their seats, and for a brief moment they sparkled with pride, glancing around to ensure others noticed them. Then their eyes landed on him, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, his coat draped neatly over the back of his chair, his posture straight but unassuming. Their smiles tightened instantly. Surprise flickered across their faces before it twisted into ridicule. They leaned toward one another, whispering words sharp enough to pierce the air. What is he even doing here? His daughter's lips curled into the faintest smirk, the same expression she had worn at the dinner table when he tried to speak. His son's brow furrowed as though the sight of his father here was an intrusion, a reminder of something he would rather erase. The grandchildren giggled, covering their mouths as though his presence was some kind of embarrassing mistake. To them, he did not belong here. This was a hall of influence, of prestige, of status, and he was just an old man who, in their eyes, had nothing left to offer the world. But what they didn't see, what they refused to even imagine, was that his presence was no accident. He had not stumbled in by chance, nor come clinging to someone else's invitation. He was here because his name already lived in this place, because his influence had shaped more lives than they could comprehend, because the very air in this hall carried traces of his unseen legacy. He watched them watching him, felt the sting of their whispered mockery, but inside he was calm. Their disbelief no longer burned the way it had at the dinner table. He did not need their recognition here. He knew what was coming, and he could already sense the shift in the room, the anticipation gathering like a storm before rainfall. His family could smirk now, could dismiss him as they always had, but soon the truth would rise in front of them all. And when it came, it would not be whispered in the shadows of a dining room. It would be spoken under lights, into microphones, into the ears of journalists and leaders, into the pages of history. Their question, "What is he even doing here?" would soon have an answer so undeniable, so unerasable, that it would echo in their hearts long after the applause had died. When he rose from his chair to greet a man across the room, his family's eyes followed with that same familiar disdain. He walked slowly, with dignity in his steps, his hand extended in quiet respect. The colleague, a man in a dark suit with the posture of someone accustomed to command, smiled warmly and shook his hand. It was a brief exchange, nothing loud or theatrical, just two men acknowledging each other. But to his family, it was fuel for mockery. His son leaned toward his daughter, a whisper slipping between clenched teeth, followed by a short laugh. His grandson covered his mouth with his palm, eyes glinting with amusement. To them, their father's movements seemed desperate, as though he were pretending to belong in a world far beyond his reach. They rolled their eyes yet again, convinced he was trying to impress people who didn't know him, certain that in a room of powerful men he was invisible, irrelevant, a figure to be pitied rather than respected. Their whispers dripped with scorn. They told themselves he was clinging to attention that wasn't his, basking in a glow he had not earned. In their minds, he was a guest among giants, a relic trying to walk among the living. They could not see the truth. He was not forcing himself into this world. He had helped shape it. The laughter behind their hands was cruel, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. It was laughter meant to be hidden, meant to cut deeper because it was shared between them, an inside joke built on his humiliation. Every smirk, every sideways glance struck him harder than words ever could. They did not just doubt him, they were ashamed of him. And yet, he did not shrink. He did not bow his head, did not retreat into the shadows. He stood upright, his voice calm, his presence steady. He knew they could not see it now, but the very man they mocked for pretending would soon be revealed as someone far greater than their narrow vision could ever comprehend. He returned to his seat quietly, letting their whispers swirl behind him. They believed the room saw him as small, but he carried the knowledge that the room, in truth, saw him differently. Respect was not always loud. Sometimes it waited, building silently, until the moment it could no longer be denied. That moment was close now. He could feel it in the air, in the stillness before the shift, in the weight of the stage lights ready to burn against the silence. They thought he was pretending. Soon they would realize he had never pretended a day in his life. The lights dimmed and all the chatter that had filled the great hall melted into sudden stillness. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, glasses lowered, laughter died on lips. The room bent itself toward the stage, where a single figure now stood beneath the sharp glow of the spotlight. The CEO. His name alone carried weight in the city, his presence reshaping the air, his reputation towering above every person in that hall. He stepped forward with calm authority, his hand resting lightly on the microphone, and without a word yet spoken, the silence grew thicker, heavier, reverent. The family, who had been smirking and whispering only moments ago, leaned forward in their chairs, their faces lit with anticipation, eager to hear announcements that they believed would be about profits, expansions, awards, new heights of success. To them, this moment was the pinnacle of prestige, being in the same room as the man everyone admired, the man whose words could sway markets. They thought themselves lucky witnesses to history, spectators on the edge of greatness. In their minds, whatever the CEO would say had nothing to do with the old man sitting quietly among them. But he knew better. He sat still, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed, not on his family, but on the stage. He could feel the shift beginning, like the first rumble of distant thunder before a storm. For once, he did not feel excluded. He was not background noise here. He was not the old man mocked for talking too much. He was the reason behind a story that was about to unfold, a truth that would strike harder than any insult, brighter than any humiliation. The air was thick with expectancy, so heavy that even the smallest movements, the shuffling of a chair, the faint clearing of a throat, sounded like thunder in the silence. The CEO adjusted the microphone, his gaze scanning the room. Journalists raised their pens. Cameras blinked red lights, capturing every detail. Leaders straightened their backs, ready to hang on every word. The family held their breath, proud just to be in the presence of power. They had no idea that this silence was about to carry their undoing. They did not know that the next name spoken would not be the name of a board member, nor a sponsor, nor a faceless figure in finance. It would be the name of the very man they had dismissed, the voice they had silenced, the life they had mocked. And as the CEO's lips parted to speak, the room leaned in. The silence was no longer ordinary. It was the kind of silence that precedes revelation, the kind that sears itself into memory, the kind that would soon echo in the hearts of those who believed they had buried their father beneath their laughter. The storm was seconds away. The CEO's voice rang through the hall, steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who knew the world listened when he spoke. And then it happened. The words that shattered the night, the words that froze the smirks on his family's faces. With full sincerity, without hesitation, the CEO spoke his name. Not buried in a list, not tossed off as a courtesy, but lifted, honored, set apart like a jewel under a light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO said, his tone wrapped in reverence, "please welcome my mentor, the man whose guidance shaped my path." For a heartbeat, the room seemed suspended, as though even time held its breath. Then the applause erupted, rising like a wave crashing against the walls, filling every corner with thunder. People rose to their feet, not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but out of respect that could not be contained. Faces turned toward him. Journalists scribbled his name with urgency. Cameras swung in his direction to capture the moment. The air shook with recognition, and for the first time in years, his voice was no longer needed. His presence alone commanded everything. He did not rise immediately. He sat still, letting the truth sink into the bones of those who had mocked him only a night before. His family stared, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with disbelief. The same lips that had whispered outdated and irrelevant were now pressed shut, trembling with the weight of realization. Their father, their grandfather, the man they dismissed as background noise, was the very figure at the center of this gathering. He was not a guest. He was not an extra. He was the cornerstone. Slowly he rose to his feet. His movements were unhurried, calm, dignified. He did not smile triumphantly, did not glance toward his family for vindication. He simply acknowledged the applause with a slight bow of the head, the kind of gesture a man makes when he knows respect is his due, not his request. The clapping grew louder, some even cheering, the sound reverberating in the hearts of those who had believed he did not belong. And in that roar of honor, his family's shame burned hotter than any fire. They had silenced him at their table, rolled their eyes at his words, mocked his memories as useless stories. Now they sat in the presence of undeniable truth. The world outside their narrow circle had not forgotten him. The most powerful man in the room had declared him the source, the mentor, the guide. His name, once dismissed as nothing more than noise, now echoed louder than any laughter could ever hope to drown. It was spoken in reverence, sealed by applause, carved into the memory of every witness. And for his family, each clap of the crowd was a reminder of their blindness, each cheer a mirror to their betrayal. That night their question, "What is he even doing here?" was answered, not with anger, not with argument, but with truth undeniable. He belonged here more than any of them ever had. The applause was still echoing when the CEO lifted his hand, waiting for silence to return. The crowd obeyed instantly, their eyes fixed on him, their attention absolute. And then his voice deepened, carrying not just admiration, but something closer to gratitude. "I would not stand here tonight without this man," he said, gesturing toward him. "He was not just a friend, he was my teacher, my guide, the architect of what you see today. Every wall we built, every door we opened, every step this company has taken rests on the foundation of his wisdom." The words poured into the room like light breaking through clouds. The hall was transformed, not into a gathering of businessmen and leaders, but into a temple of acknowledgement, a sanctuary where truth was spoken aloud. The CEO did not talk about profits or strategies. He talked about nights of guidance, about lessons given quietly, about sacrifices unseen by the world, but remembered by the man who had risen to greatness because of them. "He built more than walls," the CEO continued. "He built futures. He built character. He built men. He built me. And everything you admire in this company, everything you celebrate tonight, carries his fingerprint." His family sat motionless, their pride unraveling thread by thread. Their whispers of mockery clung to them now like chains of shame. They had dismissed his stories as pointless, irrelevant. Yet here was the most powerful man in the room, declaring those same stories to be the blueprint of his success, the quiet wisdom that shaped an empire. The memories they had laughed at were the very stones upon which this company stood. The old man stood in silence, but inside he felt something shift. Not triumph, not gloating, but a deep and steady vindication. His life had not been wasted. His years had not dissolved into nothing. The sacrifices, the long nights, the invisible work, all of it lived here, in this hall, in this man's words, in the respect of hundreds who now looked at him with awe. The family dared not meet his gaze. Their smirks were gone, their laughter silenced. Every word the CEO spoke struck them with the weight of truth they could no longer deny. They had reduced him to background noise, yet here he was revealed as the foundation of something greater than themselves. Respect roared around him, but he stood calm, still, as if to remind the world that dignity does not need to shout. It was enough to be seen, enough to have his name spoken with reverence, enough to watch his children drown in the realization of how wrong they had been. For the first time in years, he was not invisible, he was undeniable. And in that moment, every wall his family had tried to build against him crumbled. The family froze as though the floor itself had vanished beneath them. Their mouths, which only yesterday twisted into smirks at his stories, now hung open, robbed of words. The eyes that had rolled in impatience at his presence now burned red with shame, unable to meet his gaze, unable to escape the truth reverberating through the hall. The man they had belittled as irrelevant, outdated, nothing more than an old nuisance, was the very man being exalted as the cornerstone of everything they now envied. Each clap of the audience was a blow to their pride. Each cheer struck like a reminder of their blindness. They sat rigid, hearts pounding, but their hands stayed still. They could not join the applause, for to do so would mean admitting their cruelty, confessing that their mockery had been aimed at the one who had carried them all along. Their silence, once a weapon used against him, now became their prison, chaining them to the weight of their betrayal. His daughter lowered her head, the memory of every word she had dismissed replaying in her mind like knives cutting through her composure. His son stared blankly, as though the man on stage were describing a stranger, desperate to deny the truth, but unable to resist it. His grandson, who had laughed at his irrelevant stories, now felt the sting of knowing those same stories had built futures, had shaped leaders, had left a mark on history that his own young life could not even comprehend. Shame does not shout, it suffocates. It clings to the skin, tightens the throat, presses against the chest until breathing becomes a labor. And in that hall, under the weight of applause, shame became their only companion. They wanted to disappear, to shrink into their chairs, to escape the eyes of the crowd who now looked toward their father with admiration they themselves had never shown. The old man did not seek their eyes, did not demand their regret. He simply stood, steady and calm, while truth did the work his voice no longer needed to do. He had no anger left for them. He needed none. The truth was louder than rage, heavier than reproach, and sharper than any rebuke he could have delivered. They had spent years convincing themselves that his worth had faded, that his voice no longer mattered. Now they saw that the world still carried his name, still honored his guidance, still stood upon the foundation he had laid. And in that revelation, their pride crumbled into dust, leaving them bare, exposed, and broken under the gaze of the very man they had betrayed. The shame in their eyes was more than regret. It was the collapse of the false story they had built around him. The truth had shattered it in an instant, leaving nothing but silence, humiliation, and the bitter knowledge that they could never undo the way they had treated him. And he, standing tall beneath the lights, knew that he no longer needed them to understand. The world already had. He did not gloat, though he had every reason. He did not turn to his family with bitter triumph, nor unleash the anger that years of dismissal had carved into him. Instead, as the applause rose higher and higher, filling the grand hall like thunder, he simply bowed his head with a slow, measured nod. That was all. No words of reproach, no demand for recognition, no desperate grasp for the approval they had stolen from him. His quiet dignity spoke louder than rage ever could. The room stood on its feet, clapping until palms stung, honoring him with a reverence his own blood had denied him. Journalists leaned forward, cameras flashed, voices whispered his name with awe, and still he stood calm, shoulders straight, the storm of humiliation he had endured now breaking into sunlight. Justice had come, not with fury, not with shouts of vengeance, but with truth unveiled in the open, undeniable, unerasable. For his family, the silence inside was unbearable. They wanted him to lash out, to explode in fury, because anger they could excuse, anger they could dismiss as bitterness. But he offered them none. His calm was heavier than condemnation, his composure sharper than accusation. By refusing to scold them, he left them alone with their guilt, with no defense against the mirror of truth held up before them. Every clap in that hall was a reminder of their betrayal. Every cheer was a hammer striking the fragile walls of the lies they had built around him. He stood there as a man who no longer needed to prove himself, as one who understood that justice does not always roar. It often whispers. It often breathes in stillness. It often rises quietly, leaving no doubt. In his silence, he was unshakable. He was more than father, more than grandfather, more than the old man who talks too much. He was legacy. He was proof. He was the architect of lives, the unseen foundation beneath towering walls, the mentor whose quiet influence had shaped giants. And in that moment, even his pain seemed to lift. The shame they had pressed upon him slid from his shoulders, replaced by a peace deeper than triumph. He no longer longed for their approval. The world had given him something greater: acknowledgement, respect, honor carved into the hearts of strangers who knew his worth better than those who shared his blood. He looked once toward the corner where his family sat, frozen, heads bowed, eyes wet with humiliation. He did not smile, did not frown, did not linger. They were no longer the center of his pain, nor the measure of his worth. His dignity had already answered everything they had denied. The hall shook with applause, but he stood still, calm, complete. Justice had spoken, not in fury, but in truth. When he finally stepped away from the lights, the applause still roared in the air, echoing against the high ceilings like a tide that refused to recede. Each clap was a seal pressed upon his legacy, a declaration stronger than any word his family had ever denied him. He moved slowly down the aisle, shoulders upright, his footsteps measured and calm, not hasty, not proud, simply steady, as if he had been walking toward this moment his entire life. The cameras turned to follow him, voices whispered his name with awe, and yet he remained composed, untouched by the intoxication of triumph. He did not need to drink from the cup of victory, for the taste of quiet justice was enough. His family sat frozen in their seats, their bodies stiff, their hands still. They could not clap, could not stand, could not do anything but watch as the man they had mocked at dinner, dismissed as outdated, irrelevant, a burden, walked through the hall as the figure at the very center of honor. The weight of their betrayal pressed on them like iron, the shame coiling around their hearts, for they knew there was no undoing what they had done. They had rolled their eyes at him, silenced him, reduced him to nothing, and yet the world had risen for him. The contrast was unbearable. He did not look at them. That was the final stroke of dignity. He owed them no satisfaction, no acknowledgement, no revenge. He was beyond them now. He had become something larger, something untouchable. He was not simply father, not simply grandfather. He was the mentor spoken of by the most powerful voice in the room. He was the man whose name would not fade, whose story would not vanish into laughter, whose legacy would not be erased by silence at a dinner table. As he reached the doors, a young man from the staff hurried forward to hold them open for him. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, but to his family it must have felt like another knife twisting. The same father they had treated as invisible was seen here as a man to be honored, a man before whom others stood aside, a man who carried respect wherever he went. He stepped into the night air, the chill brushing his face, but he felt no cold. His heart was warmed by the truth that had finally broken free. Behind him the applause slowly faded, but the echo of it lived on, unshakable. His family would carry that sound longer than he ever would, for to them it was not just clapping, it was judgment. They could never roll their eyes again without remembering how the world had risen for him. They could never laugh at his stories without hearing the CEO's voice call those same stories the foundation of success. They could never mock him without seeing that hall, that light, that standing ovation. He walked into the night not as the man they had humiliated, not as the voice they had silenced, but as the figure their betrayal had failed to erase. He was legacy itself, carved deeper than their rejection, stronger than their silence, brighter than their shame. His name had been spoken with reverence, carried on the voices of hundreds, and no laughter at a family table could ever erase it. He was no longer the old man who talked too much. He was the mentor, the guide, the architect of futures. He was the name that could not be buried, the truth that could not be silenced, the legacy that would live long after every mocking smile had withered away. And as the doors closed behind him, leaving his family in the heavy silence of their own guilt, one truth stood eternal. Respect had always belonged to him. Undeniable, unshakable, unerasable.